Indigenous people in this country are markedly overrepresented in Canadian prisons and in the justice system of the country. So much so that when he first took office, the Prime Minister directed his Minister of Justice in her mandate letter to, quote, reduce the rate of incarceration amongst Indigenous Canadians. That was November 2015. Joining us now to explain what progress has been made in the nation's capital, there's Jody Wilson-Raybould. She is Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada and the Liberal MP for Vancouver-Granville. And a welcome to you, Minister. First time on our program, I think, so it's good to meet you.
Yeah, I'm pleased to be here. Thanks, Steve.
Let me share some numbers that you know all too well with our viewers here in case they don't. We would remind them that Indigenous people make up 3% of Canada's population, but 27.4% of the prison population is Indigenous, and 37.6% of women in federal custody are Indigenous. Let me just ask you a very general question to start with. Do you find anything objectionable about those numbers?
Well, without question, the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system is something that is very disturbing. It should be very disturbing. There's many reasons for it, and I know we're going to talk about that, but the reference in my mandate letter from the Prime Minister to look at that overrepresentation and for me to reduce those numbers is surely a measurable that I am working very hard towards.
For those who say that if Indigenous people are committing a disproportionate amount of the crime, then why shouldn't they represent a disproportionate number in the prison population? What's the response to that?
Well, I think that, without question, if you commit a crime, there are punishments for the crime. But I think that in terms of looking at various populations and individuals that are in the criminal justice system, there are different reasons why people find themselves there other than being inherently criminal. And I think about Indigenous peoples when I say that, and other individuals that are marginalized, individuals, for example, that have a mental illness or an addiction issue. For Indigenous peoples, there are many challenges that community faces, and it's not just that community, but issues such as poverty, marginalization, issues that are reflective and symptoms of the ongoing colonial reality that Indigenous peoples suffer from as root causes of why the overrepresentation exists in the first place.
Now, except for the last thing you said, the colonial aspect of the tragedy that has befallen Indigenous people, you could say some of those other things about other non-Indigenous people as well. Is it important to make the distinction?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that approximately 70% of individuals that find themselves in the criminal justice system, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, that statistic, are there due or have suffered from or suffering from mental illness and addiction issues, or are from a marginalized community. So it's not just Indigenous people, although they represent a majority of those individuals. The Prime Minister today, for example, acknowledging Black History Month, recognized the overrepresentation of Black individuals in the criminal justice system. And this is reflective of a lot of the social ailments that exist that need to be addressed for all communities equally. It's just overrepresented in the Indigenous population. Issues like housing, issues like social marginalization, education, poverty, etc.
I have heard prisons referred to as this generation's residential schools. Does that resonate with you?
Well, I think that I know as the Minister of Justice and working with my counterparts in the provinces and territories, working with civil society, working with Indigenous peoples, we cannot have a justice system or the prisons in this country be the place where individuals go for lack of services in the broader society. So we have an obligation, and I take that obligation very seriously, tirelessly, as do my colleagues around the federal cabinet table and in the provinces and territories, to work in a collaborative way to recognize that we have to be coordinated in terms of providing and investing the necessary supports for individuals that need rehabilitation, for example, from drug or addiction issues, to looking at our national housing policy and how that's going to address the issue of homelessness, and a poverty reduction strategy that's going to address issues of poverty, which to a great degree individuals look to and find themselves in the criminal justice system because of issues that present themselves by way of poverty.
Minister, I presume it took a long time for things to get this bad, and therefore I presume it will take a long time for things to get better. Having said that, what hope can you give to Indigenous people today that this is a high priority for you and that you can and will do something about this quickly?
Well, I agree with your opening comment. This is an issue that has existed for a long time, and it is something that won't be solved in terms of getting rid of the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples overnight. But what I will say and can say is this is the top priority for me as the Justice Minister. I work very closely with my colleague, the Minister of Public Safety, who's responsible for prisons. As well, we're working very collaboratively with other ministers that are involved in terms of the Minister of Health, Indigenous Services, the Minister responsible for housing. This is something that the whole of government, the federal government, is committed to engaging on and working towards what might be called a national strategy in terms of reducing the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples. And one of the positive things in terms of the work that we're doing is that we're continuing to work in a really collaborative manner with the provinces and territories, as well as working with Indigenous governments, Indigenous organizations, and Indigenous peoples themselves to look for solutions that not only address the symptoms of why the situation exists in the first place in terms of addressing the increased numbers of suicides, of poverty, of lack of education in Indigenous communities, but also addressing the root causes of why the situation exists in the first place. And on the latter point, this is where I'm incredibly optimistic and excited about the opportunities under the leadership of our Prime Minister and working collaboratively with Indigenous peoples, looking at a new approach to the recognition of rights of Indigenous peoples and creating the space not only for Indigenous peoples to have a say and be a part of and actually present the solutions in the criminal justice system, but actually take a concrete role in terms of self-determination and rebuilding of their nations.
To that end of finding new solutions to old problems, I know you know Howard Sapers because he used to do a job for the federal government. He's now the Ontario Independent Advisor on Correction Reform. And he was on this program last month, and we asked him, if you were in charge, what would you do? I want to play a little snippet of what he had to say to you, and then we'll come back and chat. So, Sheldon, if you would, let's roll that clip.
I would actually gather my cabinet colleagues together, and I would get the ministers responsible for housing and health and education and social services and employment development and economic development. And I'd say, hey guys, I would really like to see myself out of a job as the minister responsible for corrections. So what are we going to do to stem the flow? Because you see, once somebody's that deeply enmeshed in the system that they've got a criminal conviction, that they're in a jail or a prison somewhere in this country, it's too late.
We're not quite done giving you advice yet. We also had Pamela Palmater on the program, along with Howard Sapers. She, of course, chair of Indigenous governance at Ryerson University, and she had this to say on the same subject. Sheldon, again, roll the clip.
First Nations should be in charge of their own policing, own justice, and own corrections issues, not the federal and provincial governments. Why would we continue to ask the people who are most racist against us to find the solutions when the solutions themselves are used against us and make the situation worse?
Okay, let's pick up on both of those pieces of advice, starting with Pam Palmater's. Is that something you feel comfortable doing, what she just recommended?
Well, I mean, I'll speak to the comment in terms of empowering, creating the space and the mechanisms for Indigenous peoples to be self-determining. And in my view, that includes self-government and enabling Indigenous communities, when they're ready, willing, and able, to draw down jurisdiction, to look at and if they do, and when they do, and many have, bring forward solutions in terms of how they want to become involved in the justice system, how they want to take over various aspects of the justice system, that this is a conversation that we're entirely open to having. Many Indigenous communities have played a role in terms of policing and a substantive role. There's no question that communities know their citizens best, and our government is certainly willing to work collaboratively with Indigenous communities, and specifically to create the space based on the recognition of rights, and that includes the right of self-government, or right to self-government, to create the space for Indigenous peoples when they bring forward their own solutions to be able to operationalize that. But fundamental to that is Indigenous communities have for 150 years, for the most part, been under the Indian Act, which is a piece of federal legislation, which is not an appropriate system of government for Indigenous peoples, or any peoples for that matter. So how do we, as a government, working with Indigenous peoples, in this case with respect to the Indian Act, First Nations, create the space for Indigenous communities to rebuild their institutions of government, and by virtue of the rebuilding of their nations, have discussions and empower those communities to operationalize their own solutions with respect to certain jurisdictions, whether that be policing or the administration of justice, for example. I think that's a really exciting area that is not new, that communities have engaged in across the country, and will continue to build on those successes that we have seen.
I do want to make sure I heard you properly and carefully, which is you are open to a conversation about a, if you like, parallel justice system and law enforcement system that Indigenous people would have control over in the country. Did I hear that right?
Well, I didn't say parallel system. What we are open to is, I mean, of course, we are under one criminal code in this country, and the administration of justice currently is a shared responsibility between the federal government and the provinces and territories. Indigenous communities have taken, in some communities, more active roles in terms of policing. Some Indigenous communities are looking at engaging in the administration of justice, have various solutions, and have engaged in restorative justice measures that I think are incredibly important. So there's lots of different ways that communities, Indigenous communities, are wanting to inject themselves to take some control and control over the rehabilitation of individuals in their communities that have come into contact with the justice system in appropriate ways, so they don't actually go back into it.
I hope you will forgive my personalizing the question this way, but I think I have to. Wouldn't you, as a person with an Indigenous background, just love to be the Minister of Justice who finally scrapped the Indian Act?
Well, I believe that we will be, I'll answer your question this way, and I'm not trying to dodge it at all. I believe that Canada will benefit from creating the space and the mechanisms and a framework for Indigenous communities to be self-determining. And that includes the right of self-government. And the Indian Act has been something that has been discussed over many years, many decades, as long as I've been alive and before that. And if we are to get rid of the Indian Act tomorrow, we have to know what the answer is tomorrow of what is going to replace it. That's not the role, in my view, of the federal government. That is the role, the federal government working with Indigenous communities, but at the direction of Indigenous communities, when they're ready, willing, and able, when they've rebuilt their institutions of government and answered the question, what will replace the Indian Act, then it's the obligation on the federal government to have created the mechanisms to enable them to move beyond it. That's not going to be the same for every community across the country. We have over 30 communities that are self-governing that have moved beyond the Indian Act, but there are many communities that are in different places. But I am a strong advocate and always have been, back to my days when I was the regional chief in British Columbia, that there needs to be a mechanism when a community is ready and that community has developed its institutions of government, talking about its and identifying who their citizens are, how they're going to elect their governing body, what it's contained within their constitution as an example, that the federal government creates the space and the mechanisms for them to move beyond it. Would I like the Indian Act to be gone tomorrow and Indigenous communities to all be self-governing? Of course I would, but we need to make sure that we work with the diversity of communities across the country. Ultimately, will the Indian Act disappear? I think so, but it will be based on the pace and the priorities of the communities themselves.
Understood. Let me try putting one other solution on the table here, since you've told us at the beginning it's your top priority to get the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in our prisons down. What about pardons? Can you simply pass a law pardoning many of the people who are behind bars right now with the thinking that they didn't belong there in the first place because of the extraordinary circumstances that put them there? Therefore, let's take an extraordinary solution to getting them out of there. Is that an option?
Well, I think that, well, first of all, I'm not responsible for pardons. That's my colleague, Minister Goodell. But I think your question invites a discussion about how we need to focus on why there are these symptoms and why there is the reality of the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system. And we need to address those symptoms, of course, but get at the root causes. And this is where myself, working with my colleagues, understanding the priorities of Indigenous communities and them wanting to be involved in the justice system, that we, one, look at preventative measures, that we look at rehabilitation when an individual has found themselves in the criminal justice system, and you know, potentially there could be discussions about pardons, but we look at specific individuals and we ensure whether they are suffering from an addiction issue, a mental health issue, the reality of the colonial legacy, which is broad, that we create the necessary off-ramps for that individual to be able to go back into the community and to live their full potential. And the way that we do that and do that most effectively, I believe, is that we work directly with the communities. We embrace the solutions that they bring forward. I believe I'm one of the strongest advocates for restorative justice measures, for recognizing in order to rehabilitate individuals, we need to take a culturally appropriate approach to that. And this is where we can learn from and gain much experience from Indigenous communities so that the individual that is there will find some recourse when they leave the justice system and hopefully not return.
Jody Wilson-Raybould, Minister of Justice, Attorney General for Canada, we appreciate your time here on TVO tonight. Thanks very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.